Playing with Power MTG. Powerful cards, powerful formats. Before we get into today's game, we wanted to give a shout out to the sponsor of this video, HelloFresh. We as Magic players love efficiency, and that's why we recommend HelloFresh. Instead of trying to plan out your grocery list, just pick out the meals you want and HelloFresh takes care of the rest. It allows you to spend less time planning out your meals and more time brewing your decks. Commander players love variety, and HelloFresh delivers with 50 weekly menu and market items to choose from. They have options that range from fit and wholesome to pescatarian to veggie. They arrive in less than a week for maximum freshness as well. I don't personally like eating the same thing over and over, so I enjoy that I can try new things all the time. One of the things that truly got me with HelloFresh was how everything was easily explained, perfectly portioned, and simple to put together. My household doesn't really want to spend all of its time with prep and cleanup, and HelloFresh really simplifies that for us. It has quick and easy recipes, 20-minute meals, and less wasted food. In fact, a University of Michigan study showed that using HelloFresh reduced food waste by at least 25%, and that is a big deal in our house. So give HelloFresh a try today. Sign up using the link below, and in less than a week, get your meals delivered right to your doorstep, pre-portioned, and ready to make. Use my link or go to HelloFresh.com and use the promo code POGPowerJuly16 for 16 free meals across 7 boxes plus 3 free gifts. Once you click, my description will live update to count up the purchases. Thanks again to HelloFresh for sponsoring this video. Now, let's start out by showcasing our fighters this evening. First, we have Mike piloting Najeela the Blade Blossom. This deck, titled Najeela Midrange, seeks to grind more value than the normal Najeela combo list. It aims to interact heavily and then eventually win through traditional Najeela combo means such as Derevi or Thassa's Oracle. Mike's opening hand contains a Verdant Catacombs, Esper Sentinel, Simian Spirit Guide, Fierce Guardianship, Veil of Summer, Birds of Paradise, and an Elves of Deep Shadow. Next, we have Matt piloting the partner pair of Krark the Thumbless and Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. This deck seeks to cast its commander and copy it many times. It wins through a variety of stormlines and classic combos such as Twin Flame and Dualcaster Mage. Matt's opening hand contains a Mana Confluence, Mystic Remora, Springleaf Drum, Baral Chief of Compliance, Frantic Search, Imperial Recruiter, and an In the Festivities. After that, we have Dan piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Thrasios Triton Hero. This deck, called Razakats, seeks to get Razakat the Foulblooded into play and use its ability to tutor up a combo to win the game. Dan's opening hand contains a Survival of the Fittest, Cyclonic Rift, Llanowar Elves, Spellseeker, Savannah, Overgrown Tomb, and a Command Tower. Finally, we have Tad piloting Korvold, Fakehurst King. This deck's game plan is simple. Cast Dockside Extortionist. A lot of CEDH decks love Dockside, but none as much as Korvold. In conjunction with reanimation effects and Korvold's powerful ability, Dockside becomes a near one-card combo. Tad's opening hand contains a City of Brass, Bayou, Marsh Flats, Ignoble Hierarch, Nature's Claim, Abrupt Decay, and a Dockside Extortionist. Without further ado, let's begin this warlike wearisome weeknight wild goose chase. Mike wins the Beta Booster Flip It or Rip It challenge and gets to start us off. Mike draws a card for turn and plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Savannah onto the battlefield. He casts Birds of Paradise. Mike passes. Matt draws a card for turn and plays a Mana Confluence. He taps it to help cast a turn 1 Mystic Remora. Matt passes. Dan draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Llanowar Elves. He ships the turn to Tad. Tad draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up an Overgrown Tomb into play untapped, paying 2 life. He casts Ignoble Hierarch. He passes. Mike draws and casts Elves of Deep Shadow. He follows it up with an Esper Sentinel. All finished up, he gives the turn to Matt. During his upkeep, Matt taps his Mana Confluence to help pay for Mystic Remora. He draws and casts a Lotus Petal. Sentinel triggers and Mike draws. Upset that nobody fed his fish, Matt casts In the Festivities. It resolves and deals 1 damage to each opponent and wipes 5 creatures off of the board. Now, having taught everyone a lesson, Matt passes. Dan draws and plays a Savannah. He casts Finehorn Elves. He passes. Tad draws and plays a City of Brass. He casts Tenderwall. Matt wonders just how many creatures his opponents will cast, and Tad gives a turn to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Breeding Pool into play untapped, paying 2 life. He exiles Simian Spirit Guide from his hand to help cast Rhystic Study. Remore triggers and Matt draws. Rhystic Study resolves and Mike ships the turn. During its upkeep, Matt lets his Mystic Remora die. He draws and taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Springleaf Drum. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. All finished up, Matt passes. Dan draws and plays a Rejuvenating Springs. He casts Survival of the Fittest, paying for Rhystic. He passes. Tad draws and plays a Bayou. He sacrifices his Tinderwall, adding 2 red. He casts Dockside Extortionist. Rhystic triggers and Mike draw. Dockside enters and he creates 3 treasures. Tad ships the turn. Mike draws, looks at his hand with nothing to do, and passes. Matt draws and plays an island. He taps Mana Confluence to help cast Krark the Thumbless. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Matt passes. At the end of Matt's turn, Tad casts Nature's Claim, targeting Survival, paying for Rhystic. In response, Dan activates Survival of the Fittest, discarding Spellseeker. He fetches up a Drannith Magistrate into his hand. Survival is destroyed and Dan gains 4 life. The turn moves to Dan. Dan draws and slams down Drannith Magistrate, paying for Rhystic. He plays an Overgrown Tomb tapped and passes the turn. Tad draws and casts a Finehorn Elves, paying for Rhystic. Tad passes. At the end of Tad's turn, Mike casts Worldly Tutor. He fetches up a Dockside Extortionist onto the top of his library. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It resolves, and Tad chooses the Path of Chaos and doesn't crack his treasures. Dockside then creates 4 treasures. Mike follows it up with a Witchclaw Talisman. He passes. Matt draws and taps his Mana Confluence to help cast his own Dockside Extortionist. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Dockside resolves, and with the trigger on the stack, Tad makes a deal with Mike. He will crack his treasures if Mike will crack his own. Mike accepts, and each of them sacrifice their treasures and float mana. Matt, feeling like he got the short end of the stick on that deal, creates 2 treasures. Matt attempts to move through phases, and in response, Mike uses his floating mana to help cast Fire Covenant, paying 11 life, targeting all of his opponent's creatures. In response, Tad uses his floating mana to help cast Abrupt Decay, targeting Witchclaw Talisman. Abrupt Decay resolves, and Witchclaw is destroyed. With Fire Covenant back on the stack, Matt casts Frantic Search. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Krark triggers, and Matt loses the flip, returning Frantic Search to his hand. Then Fire Covenant resolves, wiping most of the board. With the board reset, once again, Matt passes. Dan draws and plays a Tropical Island. He casts his commander, Tymna the Weaver, paying for Rhystic. Dan ships the turn to Tad. Tad draws and taps his City of Brass to help cast Grim Monolith, paying for Rhystic. All finished up, Tad passes. Mike draws and plays a Taiga. He casts his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He gives the turn to Matt. Matt draws and taps his Mana Confluence to help cast Baral, Chief of Compliance. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. Matt passes. Dan draws and immediately moves to combat. He attacks Tad with Tymna. Tad takes it, and Dan gains 2 life. In his second main phase, Dan pays 1 and draws 1 through Tymna. He plays a Scalding Tarn for turn. He casts his other commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero, paying for Rhystic. Dan ships the turn to Tad. Tad draws and then taps his City of Brass to help cast his commander, Korvold, Fate-Cursed King. Rhystic triggers and Tad pays. Korvold enters and triggers. Tad sacrifices his Grim Monolith. Korvold triggers again, Tad draws, and then Korvold gets a +1/+1 counter. With nothing else, Tad passes. Mike draws and casts Professional Facebreaker. He attempts to move to combat, and in response, Matt casts Stern Dismissal, targeting Najeela. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. In response, Mike casts Dispel, targeting Stern Dismissal. Dismissal is countered, and Mike moves to combat. He attacks Dan with Najeela and Dockside. Najeela triggers, and Mike creates a 1/1 warrior, tapped and attacking Matt. Dan blocks Dockside with Thrasios, and everybody takes the rest. Professional Facebreaker triggers twice, and Mike creates 2 treasures. With nothing else, Mike ends his turn. Matt draws and taps the City of Brass to help cast Burgi, God of Storytelling. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. Matt passes. At the end of Matt's turn, Dan cracks his Scalding Tarn, pays a life, and fetches up a Watery Grave into play tapped. Dan draws and plays a Gemstone Caverns. He takes no other actions and gives the turn to Tad. Tad draws and decides it's time to act. He casts Unearth, targeting his Dockside Extortionist, paying for Rhystic. The table knows this is bad news, and so Dan decides to dig. He activates Thrasios, scrying 1, and reveals an Animate Dead into his hand. Still in response, Mike cracks his treasures, floating mana. Unearth resolves, and Dockside enters, creating 2 treasures. Tad moves to combat and attacks Mike with Korvold. Korvold triggers, and Tad sacrifices his Overgrown Tomb, drawing a card and putting a counter on Korvold. Mike takes it, and in his second main phase, Tad taps his City of Brass to help cast Imperial Seal. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. Tad fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He cracks a treasure, and Korvold triggers. He draws, and Korvold gets a counter. He casts Culling the Weak, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost. Korvold and Rhystic trigger. Mike draws off of Rhystic, and with the Korvold trigger still in the stack, Matt casts Force of Will, paying a life and exiling a blue card, targeting Culling the Weak. Burgi and Rhystic triggered. Mike draws, and Matt adds a red. Culling the Weak is countered, and Baral triggers. Matt draws and discards a card. With the stack cleared up, Tad casts Lion's Eye Diamond. Tad cracks a treasure to pay for Rhystic. Korvold triggers, he draws, and Korvold gets a counter. He plays a Verdant Catacombs. He cracks it, paying a life, and Korvold triggers again. He draws, and Korvold gets another counter. He fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts Elves of Deep Shadow. Rhystic triggers, and Mike draws. Foiled in his attempt to win, Tad passes. At the end of Tad's turn, Dan casts Cyclonic Rift, paying for Rhystic, targeting Najeela. In response, Mike casts Fierce Guardianship for its alternate cost, countering Cyclonic Rift. The turn moves to Mike. Mike draws and plays a Spire Garden. He wastes no time in casting Derevi, Imperial Tactician. Knowing this is game over, Dan casts Pact of Negation, targeting Derevi. Rhystic triggers and Mike draws. In response, Mike casts Veil of Summer. It resolves and Mike draws. Pact resolves, but doesn't counter Derevi. Then Derevi resolves. It enters and taps down Bergi. Mike attempts to move to combat, and the table sees their end. Mike attacks Matt with everything. Najeela triggers 3 times, creating 3 warriors tapped and attacking Matt. Matt takes it all, and Derevi and Facebreaker trigger. Mike creates a treasure and untaps 4 lands with Derevi. He uses the rest of his Derevi triggers to tap down the rest of his opponent's creatures. Still in combat, he activates Najeela. He untaps all attacking creatures and then gains Trample, Lifelink, and Haste until the end of turn. He gains another combat. He presents a loop of attacking with his creatures, creating more and more warriors through Najeela, untapping his lands with Derevi, gaining treasures through Facebreaker, and activating Najeela again and again for infinite combat steps. He attacks his opponents until they are dead, and Mike wins the game. What a cool game. Let's do another one. First, we have Cole piloting Yuriko, the Tiger Shadow. This is a classic Yuriko list aiming to grind value with small ninjas used in conjunction with its commander to pressure his opponent's life totals. Cole's opening hand contains a Tormented Soul, Ornithopter, Temporal Mastery, Thassa, God of the Sea, Swamp, and 2 islands. Next, we have Jay piloting Animar, Soul of Elements. This classic CEDH deck aims to repeatedly cast Ancestral Statue to give Animar infinite counters. He sinks these infinite counters into Walking Ballista to win the game. Jay's opening hand contains a Gemstone Mine, Mental Misstep, Sylvan Library, Carpet of Flowers, Mystic Remora, Painter's Servant, and a Scalding Tarn. After that, we have Noah piloting the partner pair of Krark the Thumbless and Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. This is a storm list aiming to copy Krark not once, twice, but at least 3 times a goblin. In all seriousness, this is a storm deck that can go off in a variety of ways by abusing its commander's powerful spell copying abilities. Noah's opening hand contains a Rhystic Study, Dockside Extortionist, Mystic Remora, Training Center, Ancient Tomb, and his London Mulligans are Phyrexian Metamorph and Snap. Finally, we have Ian piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Kamal, Heart of Croja. This is a Rule of Law stacks deck that aims to heavily slow down the board. After grinding the table to a halt, it finishes the game through beatdowns. Ian's opening hand contains a Rule of Law, Exotic Orchard, Finale of Devastation, Ranger Captain of Eos, Esper Sentinel, Beseju Who Endures, and a Brushland. And Cole gets to start us off. Cole draws and plays a Swamp. He casts Tormented Soul. He follows it up with an Ornithopter. He passes. Jay draws and plays a Gemstone Mine. He casts Carpet of Flowers. He passes. Noah draws and plays a Training Center. He casts a turn 1, Mystic Remora. Noah gives the turn to Ian. Ian draws and plays a Brushland. He taps it to help cast Esper Sentinel. He passes. Cole draws and plays an island. He immediately moves to combat and attacks Ian with Ornithopter. Ian declares no blocks and, in response, Cole ninjutsus in his commander, Yuriko the Tiger Shadow, bouncing Ornithopter to his hand. Ian takes it and Yuriko triggers. Cole reveals a Bolas's Citadel, and each opponent loses 6. In his second main phase, he recasts Ornithopter. He passes. Jay draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 1 green through his Carpet of Flowers. He plays a Volcanic Island. He casts his commander, Animar, Soul of Elements. Jay ships the turn to Noah. During his upkeep, Noah lets his Remora die. He draws and plays an Ancient Tomb. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Rhystic Study. Esper triggers, and Ian draws. Rhystic resolves, and having upgraded from a Mystic Remora, Noah passes. Ian draws and plays a Bountiful Promenade. He casts Thorn of Amethyst. Rhystic triggers and Noah draws. Noah groans and Thorn resolves. With nothing else, Ian passes. Cole draws and plays an island. He casts Thassa, God of the Sea. Rhystic triggers and Noah draws. He moves to combat and attacks Noah with Yuriko and Tormented Soul. Noah takes it and Yuriko triggers. Cole reveals a Dokuchi Silencer and each opponent loses 2. Cole gives the turn to Jay. Jay draws, and in his first main phase he adds 2 green through his Carpet. He plays a Windswept Heath. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Painter's Servant. Animar and Rhystic trigger. Noah draws, and Animar gets a +1/+1 counter. Painter's Servant resolves, and Jay names black, giving Animar protection from essentially everything. Next, he casts Mystic Remora. Esper and Rhystic trigger, and both players draw. Satisfied with his turn, Jay passes. Noah draws and plays a Command Tower. He casts Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Noah creates 7 treasures. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast his commander, Krark the Thumbless. He follows it up with his other commander, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. It enters as a copy of Krark. He casts Phantasmal Image. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist, and then Noah creates 7 more treasures. He casts Imperial Recruiter. It enters, and Noah fetches up a Harmonic Prodigy into his hand. He casts Frantic Search. Krark, Sakashima, Esper Sentinel, and Mystic Remora all trigger. Ian and Jay draw, and then Noah flips 2 coins. Noah loses both flips and unfortunately really needed at least one of those flips to go off. Sadly, he returns the spell to his hand and passes. Ian draws and plays an Exotic Orchard. He takes no other actions and passes, discarding to hand size, including a Savine's Reclamation. During his upkeep, Thassa God of the Sea triggers and Cold Scries 1. He draws and plays an Underground River. He activates Thassa, making Yuriko unblockable until the end of turn. He moves to combat and attacks Noah with Yuriko and Tormented Soul. Noah declares no blocks and, in response, Cole ninjutsus in Dokuchi Silencer, bouncing Tormented Soul to his hand. Noah takes it, Yuriko triggers twice, and Dokuchi Silencer triggers once. He discards Tormented Soul to Dokuchi, destroying Noah's Dockside. Then Yuriko's triggers resolve, and Cole reveals a Slither Blade with each opponent losing 2, and then he reveals a Temporal Manipulation with each opponent losing 5. All finished up, Cole passes. During his upkeep, Jay lets his Remora die. He draws, and in his first main phase, he adds 2 green through his carpet. He plays a Scalding Tarn. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Taiga onto the battlefield. He casts Arbor Elf. Animar and Rhystic trigger. Noah draws, and Animar gets a counter. He casts Sylvan Library. Esper and Rhystic trigger. He pays for Rhystic, and Ian draws off of Esper. Jay passes. At the end of Jay's turn, Ian casts Abrupt Decay, targeting Krark. Rhystic triggers, and Noah draws. Abrupt Decay resolves, and Krark is destroyed. Then the turn moves to Noah. Noah draws and plays a Shivan Reef. He taps his Ancient Tomb to help cast Harmonic Prodigy. He casts Frantic Search. His copy of Krark triggers twice through Harmonic Prodigy, and Ian draws off of Esper. Noah flips 1 heads and 1 tails. He copies Frantic Search, drawing 2, discarding 2, and untapping 3 lands. Then Frantic Search is bounced to his hand. He taps his Ancient Tomb and pays 2 life to help cast Phyrexian Metamorph. It enters as a copy of Dockside Extortionist, creating 7 treasures. He casts Solve the Equation. Krark triggers twice. He wins both flips, copying the spell twice. He fetches up a Brightstone Ritual, fetches up a Jeska's Will, and then finally fetches up a Heat Shimmer into his hand. He casts Brightstone Ritual. Krark triggers twice, and in response to both, Jay removes the final counter from Gemstone Mine and pays 2 life to help cast Mental Misstep, targeting Brightstone Ritual. Both Esper and Rhystic trigger, and both players draw. Then, the original Brightstone is countered. Noah flips twice, winning 1 and losing 1. He adds 3 red. The original spell would be bounced to hand, but it got countered. He casts Jeska's Will, targeting Ian. Krark triggers twice, and Noah wins both flips. He copies Jeska's Will 2 times. He adds a total of 27 red, and then exiles Tavern Scoundrel, Arcane Signet, Tybalt's Trickery, Soul Ring, Mind's Dilation, and 4 lands. He recasts his commander, Krark the Thumbless. He casts Tavern Scoundrel from exile. He casts Heat Shimmer, targeting Imperial Recruiter. Krark and Sakashima trigger a total of 4 times. Noah wins 2 flips and loses 2 flips. He creates 2 copies of Heat Shimmer and bounces the original to his hand. He targets and copies Imperial Recruiter both times. He fetches up a Spellseeker into his hand and then fetches up a Stormkiln Artist into his hand. Tavern Scoundrel triggers twice and creates 4 treasures. Noah casts Spellseeker. It enters and triggers twice through Harmonic Prodigy. He fetches up a Grape Shot and then fetches up a Pact of Negation all into his hand. He presents a loop of casting Grape Shot with all copies targeting his opponents. Stormkiln Artist triggers each time, creating a treasure for every Storm copy. Krark and Sakashima trigger 4 times per cast, and yes, he really did roll for these on camera. Every time he loses, Grape Shot bounces back to his hand and he recasts this. He does this repeatedly, netting mana, dealing damage to his opponents, and increasing the storm count until his opponents are dead, and Noah wins the game. We have time for one more, so let's go again. First, we have Matt piloting the partner pair of Krark the Thumbless and Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. This is a Storm deck, which, I think you already know what it does at this point, so we're just going to go ahead and say Matt's opening hand contains a Birgi, God of Storytelling, Mana Crypt, Misty Rainforest, Jeweled Lotus, Island, Spellseeker, and an Impulse. Next, we have Dan piloting the partner pair of Tymna the Weaver and Thrasios Triton Hero. Dan's opening hand contains an Esper Sentinel, Wooded Foothills, Mystic Remora, Gemstone Caverns, Flusterstorm, Diabolic Intent, and an Overgrown Tomb. After that, we have Tad piloting Korvold, Fey Cursed King. Tad's opening hand contains a Marsh Flats, Deathrite Shaman, Eldritch Evolution, Vampiric Tutor, City of Brass, Entomb, and a Final Fortune. Finally, we have Mike bringing back Najeela the Blade Blossom. Mike's opening hand contains a Scrubland, Misty Rainforest, Plateau, Professional Facebreaker, Dockside Extortionist, Rite of Flame, and an Esper Sentinel. And Matt gets to start us off. But Tad has a pregame action and puts Gemstone Caverns onto the battlefield, exiling Overgrown Tomb. Matt draws and plays a Misty Rainforest. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Volcanic Island onto the battlefield. He casts Mana Crypt. He casts Birgi, God of Storytelling. He follows it up with a Jeweled Lotus. Birgi triggers and he adds a red. He cracks his Jeweled Lotus to cast his commander, Krark the Thumbless. Birgi triggers and he adds a red again. Krark resolves, and already sitting in a strong position, Matt passes the turn. Dan draws and plays a Wooded Foothills. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a tropical island onto the battlefield. He casts Mystic Remora. In response, Matt reveals his Don't Feed the Fish tattoo, points to it and says, "Do not make me tap the sign." The table laughs and Mystic Remora resolves. Dan follows it up with an Esper Sentinel. He passes. Tad draws and plays a Marsh Flats. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Badlands onto the battlefield. He casts Deathrite Shaman. Tad ends the turn. Mike draws and plays a Plateau. He casts Esper Sentinel. He passes. During his upkeep, Matt loses his Mana Crypt roll and takes 3 damage. He draws and plays an Island. He casts his other commander, Sakashima of 1,000 Faces. Bergie triggers and adds a red. Sakashima resolves and enters as a copy of Krark. He moves to combat and attacks Dan with Krark and Bergie. Dan takes it, and all finished up, Matt ships the turn to Dan. During his upkeep, Dan pays to keep his Remora. He draws, takes no other actions, and passes the turn. During his upkeep, Tad activates his Deathrite Shaman, exiling a land from Matt's graveyard to help cast Vampiric Tutor. Both Espers and Mystic Remora trigger. Tad doesn't pay, and everyone draws. Tad then fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. Tad draws and plays a Polluted Delta. He cracks it, pays a life, and fetches up a Bayou onto the battlefield. He casts a Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and Tad creates 4 treasures. He cracks 3 treasures to help cast Eldritch Evolution, sacrificing Dockside as an additional cost. Remora triggers, and Dan draws. Eldritch resolves, and Tad fetches up an Eternal Witness onto the battlefield. It triggers and returns Dockside from his graveyard to his hand. All finished up, Tad passes. Mike draws and plays a Volcanic Island. He casts Rite of Flame. Remora and Esper trigger, and Dan draws 2. Mike adds 2 red. He uses it to help cast his own Dockside Extortionist. It enters, and he creates 4 treasures. He cracks some of his treasures to help cast his commander, Najeela the Blade Blossom. He cracks a treasure to help cast Ignoble Hierarch. He moves to combat and attacks Dan with Esper. Noble Hierarch's Exalted triggers, and Esper Sentinel gets +1/+1. Dan takes it, and Mike ends the turn. During his upkeep, Matt wins his Mana Crypt roll. He draws and plays a Fiery Islet. He casts Spellseeker. Bergie triggers and adds a red. Spellseeker resolves, and he fetches up a Jataxian Probe into his hand. He pays 2 life to help cast Jataxian Probe. A lot of triggers happen. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, Remora, and both Esper Sentinels trigger. Matt pays for both Esper Sentinels, Dan draws off of Remora, he adds a red through Bergie, then with both Krark triggers on the stack, Dan casts Flusterstorm, with all copies targeting the original Jataxian Probe. Mike Sentinel triggers, and he draws. The original probe is countered, and Matt finally flips for his Krark triggers. Matt wins 1 Krark flip, looking at Dan's hand and drawing a card. He loses the other Krark flip, but doesn't return Jataxian Probe because it's already been countered. He casts a Lotus Petal. Remora triggers, and Dan draws. Bergie triggers, and he adds a red. He taps his Fiery Islet to help cast Impulse. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, and Remora trigger. Dan draws off of Remora, he adds a red through Bergie, he then wins 1 Krark flip and loses 1 Krark flip. He copies Impulse, looking at the top 4, putting 1 into his hand and bottoming the rest. He then returns the original to his hand. He casts Mox Diamond. Remora triggers, and Dan draws. Bergie triggers, and he adds a red. It enters, and Matt discards a land. He recasts Impulse. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, and Remora all trigger. Dan draws off of Remora, Matt adds a red through Bergie, and then he loses both flips, returning Impulse to his hand. He cracks his Lotus Petal to help cast Impulse for the 3rd time. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, and Remora all trigger again. With all the triggers on the stack, Tad casts Entomb. Both Espers and Remora trigger, and Tad doesn't pay for any of them. Tad then fetches up an Underworld Breach into his graveyard. Then Matt doesn't pay for Dan's Remora, and he draws. Bergie triggers, and Matt adds a red. Krark and Sakashima's triggers resolve, and Matt loses both flips again. The table cheers, Matt cries, and Impulse returns to hand. He casts Lightning Bolt, targeting Najeela. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, and Remora trigger again. Dan draws, and then Matt adds a red through Bergie. Krark and Sakashima's trigger resolve, and he loses them again. Matt curses the luck gods and our Lord and Savior Ken, and he casts Lightning Bolt again, targeting Dan this time. Krark, Sakashima, Bergie, and Remora all trigger again. Dan draws, and Matt adds a red through Bergie. Then the Krarkashima triggers resolve and loses 1 flip, and then finally wins 1 flip. Dan takes 3 from Lightning Bolt, and the original is bounced to Matt's hand. He moves to combat and attacks Dan with Krark, Sakashima, and Bergie. Dan takes it, and in his second main phase, Matt casts Lightning Bolt again, targeting Dan. You might be asking, with what mana? Don't forget, Bergie says this mana persists through phases. Both Krarks, Bergie, and Remora trigger. Dan draws off of Remora, and then Matt adds a red through Bergie. Matt wins 1 Krark flip and loses the other. Dan takes 3 from Lightning Bolt, and the original is returned to his hand. He casts Lightning Bolt for what feels like the 600th time. Both Krarks, Bergie, and Remora trigger. Dan draws off of Remora, and Matt adds a red through Bergie. Matt wins 1 Krark flip and loses the other. Dan takes 3 from Lightning Bolt, and then the original is returned to Matt's hand. He repeats this process exactly 3 more times. Dan draws each time, and then on the last flip, Matt wins both flips. In total, Dan takes 9 damage from Lightning Bolt and draws 3 cards. With Lightning Bolt finally being in the graveyard, and then after sucking up all the turn equity in the universe, Matt passes the turn. During his upkeep, Dan lets his Remora die. Also during his upkeep, he casts Vampiric Tutor. Esper triggers, and Mike draws. Dan fetches up a card onto the top of his library and loses 2 life. He draws and plays a Morphic Pool. He casts Mox Diamond, discarding City of Brass. He casts Lion's Eye Diamond. He casts Entomb, fetching up an Auriok Salvagers and putting it into his graveyard. He casts Reanimate, returning Auriok Salvagers to the battlefield, losing 4 life. He cracks his LED, discards his hand, and adds 3 white. He uses this mana to activate Auriok Salvagers, returning LED to his hand. He presents a loop of activating Auriok Salvagers, returning LED to his hand, casting it, and then cracking it for 3 white. With each iteration, he nets 1 white. He then uses this mana now to cast, crack, and return LED, netting all other colors as well. He casts his commander, Thrasios, Triton Hero. He uses some of his infinite mana to activate Thrasios to draw his library and put all lands onto the battlefield tapped. He casts Thassa's Oracle. It enters, triggers, and Dan wins the game. Ladies and gentlemen, what a crazy fun set of games tonight. Congrats to Mike, Noah, and Dan on their wins. In Game 1, Mike's game plan was clear from the beginning: sit back and interact. He stuck an early Rhystic Study and was able to turn that into huge card advantage. He waited until his opponent's interaction was spent before going for his combo finish. In Game 2, Noah's lucky flips got him there in the end. Noah showed the power of even letting 1 Krark remain on the battlefield. The answer to many commander-focused CEDH decks is simply to destroy the commanders, and it is even more true in Sakashima. Noah gained incremental value from his commanders and Rhystic Study, and then turned that into a clean storm win. In Game 3, Dan profited off of having the right taxing effects for his greedy opponents. He interacted at key moments and then weathered the storm until it was his time to strike. Dan embodied the true control player's mindset of, I'm not countering it unless I'm losing the game. He let his opponents cast cards into his Remora and then sat back gaining value. Well, that about wraps it up for this episode. Tune in next time when we duke it out to see who will be king of a competitive EDH table. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you next time.